Bungie. We're not being accused of lying to investors, mass firing staff, and otherwise pissing off everyone in the known universe. They occasionally make video games. They're behind Destiny 2, a game whose public perception seems to be based entirely on the phase of the moon, and Marathon, an early era FPS they're currently giving the Prey treatment. They also made Halo or something. I don't know, I haven't read the Bible. But before they really hit the big time, there was a game called Oni, a cyberpunk third-person shooter slash platformer slash beat 'em up developed by Bungie West as their only game before being absorbed into the Bungie collective. It had a rocky development, met lukewarm reviews, sold sort of all rightish, and then fell to the wayside under the monolith of everything they put out since. But much like other similar cases, the game has developed its own little cult following over the years, so maybe they got it wrong. I am the resident gremlin, the purveyor of the weird, the retro, and the forgotten, and today we are looking at Oni. Much like many games of the early 2000s, Oni the game doesn't really explain its setting at all, with all major background relegated to the manual. The game takes place in 2032 and the world has gone to hell. The planet is all but uninhabitable, the corrupt World Coalition government has taken over basically everything in an economic coup, and what's left is a full-blown police state where the rich get richer and everyone else either falls in line or gets shunted to the fringes of society, where crime is rife and death could be a single breath away. And in those fringes lies the Syndicate, a shadowy crime organisation that sold drugs and guns to the downtrodden, but were left to their own devices by the state. That was until a man named Muro took over. Now they're expanding their operations, growing their power, and has the powers that be a little bit nervous. And that's where you come in. Meet Konoko, orphan ward of the state and newest member of the TCTF, the government's police arm and enforcers, while monitoring her way too closely for just checking in on a raw recruit. You must track down the Syndicate, find out what they're doing and stop them, all while trying to learn the truth of who she really is. Now, that's a good bit of preamble and sets up a quite compelling world. And while it's not really mentioned in-game, I kind of enjoy that Oni starts as events start to hit a fever pitch, rather than a heavy helping of exposition at the beginning. Adds a little intrigue to proceedings. Intrigue that the game doesn't really do a whole lot with. Firstly, the whole super totalitarian government angle isn't really touched until the latter half of the game, same with Konoko's mysterious origins and nature. You get some hints thrown your way at the very start and the middle that she's not just any old human, with Mission 8 being the only solid mention of the Chrysalis, only for the game to hit you with an exposition dump in Mission 12. I admire the attempt at breadcrumbing that Oni tries to do, but it all feels too backloaded to feel natural. It's also similar to how the game handles the Muro Syndicate plotline, which is covered only in text logs in the game's final mission. For the rest of the game, specifically missions 1 through 5, you're just trying to stop the Syndicate from doing something. See, there's no real hints as to what they're doing, why they're doing it, or what their ultimate end goal is. You go from a warehouse, to a factory, to a lab, and then to an airport where the story beat gets sidelined for the rest of the game, while the TCTF go after Konoko for going AWOL, believing her to be a threat due to her special condition. On that note, you can tell by looking at the game it's taking very heavy influences from Ghost in the Shell, from the aesthetic to Konoko herself sharing a lot of similarities with Motoko, even having similar names. Where this kind of falls apart is, while Oni tries to do Git's what defines humanity thing, due to how they convey the story, it falls kind of flat. There isn't really enough room in the runtime to properly explore the theme to its full potential, with everything else going on. It just about gets to its feet before the game ends. They also try, in a way, to push the theme of lesser of two evils between the Syndicate and the government slash the TCTF. The issue is that there is no lesser evil. Both sides are equally monstrous, Muro essentially vying to become de facto emperor of the world and ruling with an iron fist, or the government already doing that. The closest we really get to a somewhat good resolution to this plotline is a very disappointing final cutscene that kind of boils down to forcing the government to help people to save its own skin. Otherwise, we just get Cyberpunk as a backdrop to the action, but very little of the substance of an actual Cyberpunk story, and a lot of questions left unanswered. Specifically, who the hell is Mikade? Right, I'm going to have to preface this part very clearly. This review is based on the PS2 version of the game. I have seen many reviews of this game before being played on the PC's Anniversary Edition. Basically all of them, in fact, to the point I felt like I was being gaslit into believing that the PC version has always been far superior and I was going insane. That was until I found footage from a channel by the name of DW Terminator from 13 years ago, seemingly of the original PC version, the same as the PS2. The point I'm trying to make is that the Anniversary Edition makes certain fixes, improvements, and quality of life changes to the game that are not present in the original version, which I am covering in the interest of covering only as God intended. My experience will be different from others. My experience will be worse. As I've said previously, this game is a shooter, platformer, beat 'em up, but rather than being an interconnected system, it is, or at least it feels, split into 3 distinct components. This being the case, let's look at each part separately, starting with the gunplay. Oni has a decent assortment of firearms ranging from handguns to rocket launchers, even after many were left on the cutting room floor. That being said, the game also heavily disincentivizes using them for the most part, or at least tries to. For the vast majority of missions you start without a gun, so every weapon has to be scavenged from enemies, which poses an interesting mechanical touch. The guns enemies drop have an accurate ammo count, which is to say, if an enemy fires off 2 shots from a 10-round mag, it'll only have 8 left when you pick it up. Or, more commonly, no ammo at all, because enemies also don't have infinite backup ammo. It's supposed to make you try to use the game's stealth mechanics to take them out before they can get a shot off, but in practice it's more of a case of waiting for them to reload so you can disarm them to get a full complement. Backup ammo, how scarce it is in most of the game, drops from specific random enemies or can be given to you by civilians that you save or intimidate in a level, along with healing hypos and force shields to block incoming gunfire. And you'll need that last one because the guns are almost always deadlier in enemies' hands than yours. Handguns and SMGs will shred your health like no tomorrow, the plasma beam just permanently staggers you, and the super ball will absolutely one-shot you because enemies are dumb and have no survival instincts, so melee range grenade launcher is 100% on the table at all times. The only guns that really give you, the player, any crumb of advantage most of the time is the railgun, which one-shots enemies 99% of the time, albeit on a long cooldown, and the screaming cannon, because enemies are dumb and have no survival instincts and will just walk into the shot, especially their own. Enemy AI being thick as 2-shot planks is a running theme with this game. The biggest downside of the weapons is actually the level design. Even for the time, most of the levels are bland and basic, typically office buildings and almost identical labs and machine rooms, but the real issue is they're primarily connected with massively long corridors with little to no cover. Being aesthetically boring aside, this might sound absolutely perfect for shooting at enemies down, but those sightlines aren't for you. You see, while Oni does have a lock-on mechanic, it's automatic and you have to be weirdly close to the target for it to trigger, and it really isn't a fan of you trying to move while shooting. And sometimes it just doesn't work at all, leaving you firing at the nearest flat surface rather than the dude to your right. Conversely, enemies can lock on from much further away and are much more reliable. So if they're using something hit scan like a handgun or an SMG, or if there's more than one person in a firefight, you're going to lose in most cases unless you're a master marksman. While a problem in most of the various building interiors that make up the game, especially Mission 12 where you get in a firefight with an enemy in all black armour stood on black stairs so bullets look like they're just coming out of the ether. Yes, I'm still mad about this. The real issue arises from the outside maps, such as missions 5, 10 and 14, where the render distance completely dies, because the AI will shoot you from outside of that distance while you physically cannot shoot back. This got somewhat fixed in AE where they extended the draw distance considerably, which also makes the Mikado fight much less tedious. On that note, bosses are completely immune to guns, just in case you were planning on cheesing anything. Next up, the platforming. All told, there's not actually a lot of platforming in this game. In the tutorial, while going over movement controls, Shinatama explains that there may be useful items hidden in hard-to-reach areas, which you would reasonably take to mean that there are goodies scattered around the missions that can only be obtained by parkouring around the map, or in out-of-the-way places. However, this really isn't the case, mostly due to how spartan the maps are. There's only a couple of truly out-of-the-way pickups in the game, with the vast majority even being just slightly elevated platforms or behind a box in the corner of the room, and neither of those are particularly difficult to reach. You can just walk. And there's even fewer examples of it being needed for progression, as most of the time you're just going up and down hilariously large ramps and stairwells. Which is honestly a blessing in disguise because, to be frank, the movement mechanics in Oni are rather half-baked. There's definitely neat ideas here, the slide and the jump flip especially, but the game lacks a lot of the quality of life mechanics of its contemporaries. I understand that the platforming isn't the main focus, but just the inclusion of something simple like a ledge grab could easily have opened up more interesting progression options, because as it stands, every level in the game is just a series of pressing a button, opening a door, then pressing another button, for 14 whole missions. Occasionally they'll throw in laser puzzles and they're their own kettle of fish. Because of how awkward the jumping controls are and how poorly positioned the camera is, these lasers become supremely annoying to traverse, as tripping them usually triggers the security system. Sometimes this isn't a problem, like Mission 5's poison hallway that doesn't actually lock the exit door if you touch the lasers. But other times, it's life or death, like the start of Mission 12 where the game dumps you in a laser hallway, and if you trip one, you get blasted by 10 railguns at once and insta-killed. Which is fun. To be fair, immediately after there's an instance of platforming that's assuredly not intended, also skips the most awkwardly arranged stealth section in the entire game. All that said, Oni does have some really clever action platforming moments that give a glimpse of what they can do and what could have been. Mission 10 is a chase across the rooftops, jumping from building to building at night, missing only the neon lights of a cyberpunk skyline to really sell the experience. Or Missions 7 and 8 in the air processing plant, where Kanoko has to run across multiple of these massive power cables, dodging gunfire and jumping electrical pulses. They are really intense moments, and the game could have stood to have more of this level of action. Finally, we get to the combat, the main focus of Oni and what you'll spend the majority of your time doing. It is, by far, the most fleshed out part of the entire game. The best way to describe the combat is that it's somewhat reminiscent of the classic side-scrollers like Streets of Rage and Double Dragon, with the added bonus of a third dimension. I feel you'd be hard-pressed to disagree with me on that. It has all the hallmarks of a beat-em-up. A basic combo system, grapple attacks, jump attacks, running attacks, colour-coded tiered enemies, and special moves. Add to that blocking, dodging, directional attacks and crouch attacks, as well as enemy health being displayed non-intrusively by the colour of the hit spark, you'll have a pretty robust system that does what it's designed to do really well when it all comes together. When you get into the flow, you really do feel like a badass. While I don't fully agree with the hyperbole that it's the best combat system ever, it's not hard to see why. However, there are some issues that do absolutely ruin the flow. The most prominent being, rather unfortunately, fighting multiple enemies at once. Because in a bizarre twist, the combat flounders outside of a 1v1 fight, and not just in terms of difficulty. It's more fundamental of a problem than that. Firstly, the game gives you very few tools to deal with a group of enemies. You get a few AoE super moves that can give you the space if you're crowded, but they are all very backloaded into the late game where they're much less useful, and more encounters are just resolved by launching a screamer through an open door. Now that's a sentence. There are directional attacks, but you don't ever want to be in a position to use them, purely because of how the block works. Blocking in Oni is done by facing the enemy and not moving. So to be able to avoid being bounced around like a rubber ball, you need enemies to be face on with you. How block works is also counterintuitive because many combos need directional inputs, so you cannot block while setting up these moves either, but that's a lesser issue. This all leads to a very common strategy of spam crouch kicking and chain throwing enemies to give you room to breathe and reposition. And while some of these grabs are cool as all hell, it's a little bad when a good chunk of the move list feels unusable in most encounters. Maybe the issue with the group encounters, as well as the skewed power balance of weapons, is why there is a token attempt at stealth mechanics, with the ability to instantly take out almost any enemy in the game. That being said, they also included some really diabolical enemy placements, so you basically get zero time to capitalize unless you have cloak active, and due to how short that is active, you probably won't. There's also the minor quirk of the game hitting a staggering FPS of 2 when there is more than 3 enemies on the screen at once, and you get to enjoy your death in the form of a slideshow. Granted, this and the late game combo problem is resolved in the Anniversary Edition, but the original release is, in a word, rough. When you finally get a shot at a 1v1, the combat gets a lot better, but it still has its own share of problems. To begin, the camera being aimed slap bang in the middle of Kanoko's back makes spacing really hard to judge, which leads to a lot of attacks just whiffing unless you're rubbing your face on their chest, which isn't something you particularly want to be doing for various reasons. Oni's block mechanics notwithstanding. Another related problem is that the enemies are by and large taller than you. This sounds like a non-issue on the surface, but you think about it for a bit, or hell, just experience it, it becomes a whole lot clearer. Because they are taller than Kanoko, they have longer limbs than Kanoko, which means they have longer reach. Meaning, they can hit you outside of your ability to retaliate, making some of the encounters feel pretty BS as you just get slapped around with the equivalent of them holding you at arm's length. Now, back once again on my crusade against the block system. You know how I said it requires you to stop moving? Well, enemies also have unblockable attacks. These unblockables are also not the most readable moves in the game and are awkward to react to. While not incentivized more than blocking, dodging is somewhat a safer bet, but by no means perfect of a solution because you get no iframes out of it, so you misjudge the attack, you're getting hit for massive damage. Grabs. You know how you can do grabs? Well, so can the enemy, and as a fun little gameplay choice, they are frame 1 and completely unavoidable. I mean it, there is no animation or anything to warn you it's coming. You just get scooped up and thrown around in whichever manner the specific enemy chooses. Oh, and it also has absolute priority, so you can have literally just hit them with something, then they've actually been staggered, but the grab will still go through. Intentional or just janky coding, it's probably one of the worst aspects of the combat, not helped by how grab happy some of the enemies are. Even Muro. Especially Muro. These grabs hurt. Not just the grabs either. Enemy damage on normal is genuinely insane across the board, to the point that about Mission 5 I developed an inkling that easy was actually the dev intended difficulty. So I replayed the level, and while I can't confirm that it is, the damage output felt a lot more reasonable. To the point where I felt I could actually use the Diodon Surge mechanic from overhealing, without feeling like I'd wasted a precious hypo for a single fight, and actually being able to use it instead of immediately being knocked out of it by a regular enemy. Call it a skill issue if you want, but Easy gave that feeling of being a one-woman army that you'd kind of hope from a game like this, more so for how much inspiration it took from Ghost in a Shell. The next few points are lesser problems on a whole, but I feel like they still need to be mentioned. Combos and special moves take too long to complete. Because they can't be mashed through, the enemy has time to block the ender even if you hit with the first 2 attacks, losing a lot of the damage. The slide attack points you at the nearest enemy, and the lock-on range is stupidly long. This thing will kill you if there are any ledges nearby, the end of Mission 12 being a personal hell for me in that regard. The stun gun. The bloody stun gun. Unless you have a force shield on, this thing will stun you for a solid 5 seconds, in which time the enemy can hit you with a combo or a special attack which will likely knock you to the ground. And then you get to stand up again just in time for the stun gun to be ready to fire again. The potential to get stun locked is insane with this weapon, and what's even worse is this thing breaks the game's AI. If you have a stealth cloak active, enemies should not be able to see you. However, if they pick up a stun gun, they will immediately lock onto you, stun you, then proceed to beat the crap out of you. It's a bizarre and rare bug only really experienced in one mission in the game, but it makes an already extremely difficult fight way harder and infinitely more rage-inducing. Boss fights are up next, and they are also somewhat of a victim of this game's combat issues. Far from being the highlights they are meant to be, they are much more likely to add another dimension of frustration to the proceedings. There are only 6 in the game, and of those 6, two are basically repeats of earlier fights. First up, there's Barabbas, this hulking beast of a man, and what I feel is the best boss fight in the game. He's imposing, what with his size and gratuitously large gun, but the nature of the fight really feeds into the fantasy of a nimble fighter against a juggernaut. It just feels good. The only major gripe I have is his ability to heal, but in the first fight it's easy to interrupt, so it's not really a problem. The second fight, however, when you fight him again later in the game, it's the exact same fight, but this time on a roof. And you're probably thinking, that's perfect, throw him off the roof, easy win. Well, if you throw Barabbas off the roof, he will jetpack back up, land halfway across the roof, and immediately start healing. And he will heal a considerable amount of health before you can stop him. It becomes a battle of attrition where you have nothing and he has everything. What also lets it down is the elite strikers that start appearing later in the game, because they are more or less the same as Barabbas, only without the healing and a different special move. Boss becoming regular enemies isn't exactly a novel concept, but when you have so few, it really dampens the impact of the original encounter. And that's if it goes that way. Bicade is fought at the end of Mission 10, and aside from coming out of nowhere, he's also just a gussied up version of the ninja enemies introduced in the same mission, but with some wonderfully annoying gimmicks. Firstly, he can go invisible, which isn't much of an advantage because guns can't hurt him and the arena is pitch black outside of a 5-foot range. Next up, he can teleport into the ether and will always fire a projectile at you. A projectile with the most bizarre tracking on it. I mean, how are you supposed to reasonably dodge this thing? Ultimately, the fight devolves into waiting for him to run back to you after a teleport and trying to grapple him or combo him so he can't teleport away again. It is a supreme pain in the ass that's just the cherry on this out-of-nowhere antagonist. Next we have the Deadly Brains, essentially computer systems with a human brain inside that controls massive defense systems. You fight two of them, and the term fight is a very loose one here. You have to activate 4 terminals around the room 3 times. Each time the boss's laser grid gets more challenging to traverse. The first time is, however, insultingly easy, and the second time is actually completely insane, because the number of lasers is tripled, the patterns offer little time to get through unscathed, and the turrets that get triggered will absolutely shred you. In theory. Hilariously, if you run back to the entrance and dodge roll back and forth, the plasma shots won't hit you, and the screamer pods can never reach you. Really takes the sting out of it when you can just cheese a boss like that. Finally, there's Muro, and there's actually 2 versions of this fight. The sort of fun one, and the god-awful one, based entirely on a choice from the previous mission. Guess which one I got? The sort of fun one has Muro mutate into a big dumb monster. He hits hard, but he's pretty slow and ultimately a lot more manageable. Human Muro is just awful. Ads all over the place, constantly spamming special moves and grabs that take out most of your health, while also giving you very little time to actually fight back. As a boss fight in general, it stinks, but to be the final boss, it's just awful. However, what takes this game and all its wobbles and makes them utterly soul-destroying is legitimately the checkpoint system, because it compounds all the previous problems. Checkpoints in the game are always miles apart, and we're talking 15 to 20 minutes in some places. So if you die, you will lose a lot of time and progress, especially in normal and above, as you have to slowly pick through the level to stand a chance against the mean enemy placement and combinations this game likes to throw your way. And a lot of this stems from how weirdly placed the checkpoints are. On numerous occasions, you can do huge swathes of mission objectives between each checkpoint and be forced to repeat the monotony of pressing buttons every time you die. But what's really bizarre is how the checkpoints actually work. You see, whereas most checkpoints save the entire game state, only saves Konoko's. For example, this guard from Mission 5. You can take him out in this room before he makes a break for the alarm button, and entering the next room pops a checkpoint. If you die and revert back to that checkpoint, the runner is alive and already booking it. Like I said, bizarre. All of this comes together in a rather unfortunate package, because if you have a bad section where you end up with low health, healing or other resources, your only recourse is to revert back to an earlier, healthier checkpoint, which could be 20 minutes, 40 minutes, or the very start of the level. Oni genuinely feels like it was supposed to have an immersive sim-style save system, but we just had to use a checkpoint one because of limitations. Which sucks because it ends with the game being slow and methodical rather than the fast-paced, heart-pounding action they were clearly going for, because failure means wasting way too much time. I am coming across really negative about Oni, but it comes from a place of a loving frustration. The pieces of a great game are absolutely in there. It has cool weapons, neat level concepts, the building blocks of a compelling story, and the potential for having the greatest melee combat system, but the game lacks the connecting pieces to keep everything together. Lacking quality of life components the games of the time had, and extremely weird design choices all over the place, really drag the whole thing down. But I don't blame the devs for this at all. From the sounds of it, Oni had an extremely troubled development, struggling with limitations, delays, and contractual obligation to finish due to Bungie being purchased by Microsoft at the time. There was an attempt for the sequel which fell through, and the IP belongs to Take-Two Interactive now, so the chances of a remake are slim, but I don't think I'd actually want that. I'd much prefer someone to try a spiritual successor than a full reboot. The full picture is really quite unique, and I feel some intrepid developer could do something great with the building blocks we have here. The closest we've seen is probably Mirror's Edge, hilariously, but I feel that people want something more. And if you really want to try this for yourself, just play the Anniversary Edition. The OG is really not worth the headache. But what do you guys think? How was your time with Oni? As frustrated as I was, or do you have much fonder memories? Let me know in the comments, and leave a like and subscribe if you enjoyed. I have been the Resident Gremlin, and I will see you next time.